Namaste. Today I have with me Damo, a second generation Indian American. So, Damo, please give us a little introduction of yourself.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me on here today. Like you said, I'm a second generation Indian American. I grew up mostly in the Western United States and uh, have also, I think, kind of relevant to the discussion, had grown up outside of a major Indian American community.
Right.
So usually I've been the only brown person in a room. And whether fairly or not, I'm often have been put in a position where I have to explain 1.3 billion people in a country that I actually have never had any citizenship in.
Right. So, for our audience who have no lived experience of India, it's just,
Yes.
yeah, that's
I
interesting.
mean, a few trips here and there,
All right.
I've definitely got to visit, but, it's always summer vacation, very
Wow.
hot,
Right.
and,
Yeah,
it's a different experience.
that's right. So, Damo, what I learned from Sri Rajvi Malhotra's Being Different is that America is deeply rooted in its Judeo Christian roots, despite its pop culture and melting pot themes. As an insider, could you tell us why you would call America as a Judeo Christian society?
Sure, absolutely. So one thing to keep in mind is if in an American context you're going to say the United States is a Judeo-Christian country, that can be very political, perhaps in a similar way that saying you're Hindu
Right.
in India could be perceived. And that is because this Christianity is the dominant religion and tradition of the United States. And if you look at sort of the divisions in our society right now, we have had religiosity, religious affiliation. So that would be Americans saying that I'm a member of this church, Pentecostal or Episcopal or Presbyterian. And even within a US, Christian is a very broad spectrum. And increasingly that people have chosen to just not go to church or not be as outwardly religious, especially in the blue states. And so you have a bit of a contradiction because you have a constituency in this country where they are very upset that they have lost a set of culture war type issues. Prayer in school, abortion, are kind of notable ones. And another side that is getting extremely secular and is also kind of re-examining perhaps even the fundamental assumptions about which this country was built, kind of looking at the past legacies. So it's a bit of a contradiction. So I know as from the outside, it could be confusing at times because you see these very sort of libertine, scantily clad women, all of these types of things. And one might wonder, well, wait a minute, the Bible says this, or they're a Judeo-Christian, or they might say that they're actually not a believer at all, but then an outsider sees that, wait a minute, your fundamental assumptions about, say, what religion is, even the concept of separation of church and state, the morality in which you are rebelling against, fundamentally, that is from a Christian framework
All
in
right.
many ways.
And does these beliefs and philosophy influence their foreign policy, or does it permeate at the administrative level as well, like the
So
Judeo-Christian beliefs?
that's a really great question. I mean, again, this is also a very loaded question. If you were to go to maybe certain regions of the country, uh, having sort of these outward displays of, especially Christian, if we talk specifically about the, kind of Christian affiliation, some people wear it with pride in certain regions.
Okay.
I don't happen to live in a region where that's common, but I've lived in regions where that is common. Uh, if you go back to the past, and again, this might be, interesting from an Indian perspective, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, it was kind of a big deal that he was Catholic because people were saying like, oh, maybe he's going to be loyal to Rome. Maybe he's not, Anglo-Saxon Protestant. The term is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, WASP, and he was Irish. And to them, to the British, right, the Irish they weren't exactly like them. And so, now when you look at kind of the foreign policy and just how America sees itself in the world, one argument I'm sure that is going to be made increasingly more is that even so-called secular, we want to have these universal values. You could argue that, well, that actually is sort of a very Christian type of view. You've just swapped it with your secular humanism. And in fact, that is an argument that I've actually seen Christians in the US themselves make.
Right.
Saying that you have just changed your religion or your belief structure to something else. Now, for me, it's hard for me to say because I'm an American, and so my civic duty is to this country. So I see it in those terms, and so I might actually have probably internalized a lot of these
Right.
beliefs, right?
Right.
And it's an assumption that we know the right way, that we want to share it, and we believe that there are these ideals that should apply to everyone.
Right.
And even if you think about why we talk about why are we friends with India? Why is India a partner with us? It kind of goes down to, oh, they're a democracy like we are. They have these same values like we do. Maybe they speak English. They seem to have internalized our Anglo-Saxon culture, right?
Right. Right. And we also know that the America's grand narrative is largely based on American exceptionalism. So, and we believe it's entrenched in the school system and it's taught right from childhood.
Hmm. Oh,
Do you,
absolutely.
is that
Uh,
so?
I would say that, as we say in America, I've definitely drank the Kool-Aid, which is to say that, growing up, we used to all say the Pledge of Allegiance in school. So pledge allegiance to the flag. And kind of going back to the kind of religious debates we've had, when I was growing up, the debate was whether the school could make you say under God, one nation under God, or not. Uh, my school was a school where we happened to say that, one nation under God. And we are taught that, we came, America is a place where the oppressed peoples of Europe, or the downtrodden of Europe, could get a new chance. The Thanksgiving holiday we have, which will be in a couple months, that is about the Pilgrims, who were a sect of Christianity that just happened to be persecuted in England. They escaped. They came over. Sure, they did subjugate the native, eventually, get rid of the Native Americans, but at least for this supposed holiday, they broke bread together.
Wow, that's interesting. So, how would you define America's secularism when compared to the Indian version?
So I find the Indian version very confusing. It is, and I understand that this is a huge debate in India.
Yeah.
And to be clear, I mean, I am a cheerleader for India, regardless of who's in power. And so this is really just for me, on the outside, I just support. But that disclaimer aside, so in the US, the First Amendment of the Constitution establishes freedom of religion. Now, part of that debate could be that, well, unlike the Swedish or the or the English, we don't have a Church of America.
Right.
We're not officially tied to the Catholic Church. So, this goes back to sort of a very European model of interstate relations and, relations between especially the Catholic Church and the Europeans. So in the US context, it is very, I lost my train of thought, because it's a very complicated issue. So
Right.
we, um, we kind of have to draw a very fine line with, we can say that my individual right to be a Hindu comes from the First Amendment of the United States, which, even though you could argue that, this was maybe was it not favoring one church or the other, because the United States is a Judeo-Christian country, but, right now, and certainly in the mainstream, I think people have an understanding, or that, and this is definitely something that I would push for politically, that I am able to be Hindu, I'm able to be Muslim, and the state really has no business in dictating or making sort of judgments on how, the inner workings of the religious community operate, because it doesn't recognize it recognizes maybe a protected class of people for, say, discrimination purposes, but, uh, they might allow sort of private arbitration with, say, if you want to do inheritance matters or marriage law, like, Jewish people, they have their, some of their internal rabbinical courts. Muslims have, there may be their private Sharia arbitration. And so those can exist, but at the same time, there are certain things where those laws apply to everyone.
Right.
So, for example, Utah is the land of Mormons. Now, in the beginning, and to be clear, so the modern mainstream Church of Latter-day Saints rejected polygamy. And part of that had to do with their relationship with the United States, because Utah, they settled. And then when they were being integrated into the country, the US said, no, you cannot be polygamous. That was a sticking point. And even today, there are some renegade sects who practice it, but technically they're not supposed to. And it's not like the US said, oh, well, you're Mormon, fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints, and so you can be polygamous because that is your culture. That wouldn't really work here.
Right. And also in America, we learned that Buddhism is viewed as something that is starkly different from Hinduism. And but although they are both sister faiths, so could you tell us why you would see it that way? And also, to a certain degree, they are more accepting of Buddhism, but also in academia, we find that they're very hostile to Hinduism when compared to Buddhism. So could you tell us why this bias and why you would view it as dharmic
Sure.
faith?
So part of it is, if you look at the history of the US and the history of immigration from Asia, uh, primarily it began with East Asia. The Chinese date back to the 1800s. They built a lot of the railroads in the Western US. So there's been a more of an exposure to Buddhism. And say with Hinduism, those terms, there's definitely an India relationship with that. I mean, we don't have a lot of Balinese Hindus coming to the US, for example. So Buddhism sort of has this sort of Asian appeal. There's a bit of branding differences. So, there is, and then especially with, if you look at, say, some of the Zen Buddhist practices, even the way that they organized just happens to be in ways that maybe are more understandable to the West. So that, you have Buddhist abbots, you have Buddhist monasteries. You can sort of take the same terminology that is used sort of for the Catholic, especially, or Orthodox context, and then, understand like, oh, okay, so they have their Jesus figure and they have a church. And with Hinduism, it's not like that, right? It is tied to a lot more different rituals that are very specific even to region or community. And it is also tied to this whole set of discourse that specifically exists about India in a
Right.
way that it doesn't about these other countries. So then it gets tied into, oh, well, the caste system, or the, whatever huge volume of English language literature and media discourse that comes out of India from Indians themselves sort of processing their own
Yeah.
history and having their debate. And so they see this, and, for me, and I'll be honest, it's like, I'll read, you know, descriptions of Indian history, and I remember this growing up, where it's like the Americans say one thing, and then the Indians say 10 things, and it's very difficult. And then,
Right.
it just, so I think it's the India factor, I think, in some respects.
So it's the complexity that sort of drives them away. But we also
Yeah.
find that there's a strong inherent hostility. And I think largely, like as you rightly pointed out, many Indians themselves are responsible for propagating that sort of a narrative.
Absolutely. It's because when where I grew up, and I grew up in a very Christian environment,
Oh,
and it's, so on one hand, yes, I'm aware that there is Buddhism and that it has evolved into distinct forms throughout, Southeast and East Asia. But at the same time, when you are juxtaposed against a Christian backdrop, they have a lot of the same types of vocabulary, the worldview, the cosmology, and together, just like how maybe in India, the Mormons are not seen as Christian, the Catholics, a lot of times they distinguish Catholics versus Protestants very clearly. Whereas for me, they were more alike than they were different.
yeah,
And, you know, even things, the bad, quote unquote, bad things that are associated with Hinduism, a lot of that is, you could say, well, was that just Indic culture or South Asian culture. Because if you go to Thailand, if you go to these other countries, you see a lot of references to caste identities, Varna identities. You see their own versions of inequality. I've seen claims that colorism apparently is some Brahminical patriarchy thing, but just go through the rest of Asia, even Bollywood people are not over there. They have this prejudice, right?
Right. Partly responsible for exporting these distorted versions of our culture.
Yeah,
All right.
exactly.
Okay. This was a wonderful conversation. Now, in the second episode, we'll discuss race, caste, and the internal problems of the Indian American community.